So you can help contribute to the work we're doing in Muskegon tonight by making a donation. So we appreciate the help. We are a volunteer organization. I do want to now introduce Pete Miller. Pete Miller is the conservation chair, and he's going to give you an update on our work in Muskegon. Thanks, Pete.
All right, welcome and thank you. I am going to attempt to share my screen real quick. And come over here. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen real quick. And again, my name's Peter Miller. I'm the conservation chair for Schrems Trout Unlimited. And, really, I just want to do a couple quick thank yous before I give you a little update on the river. And first, thank you to Matt Zudwig, who has donated this beautiful artwork to our banquet, which has now been moved back to October. He did a great job there. And, one of the great things with this crazy time is just seeing how our community has come together, knowing that, Matt's donating this. Kevin has been instrumental in the project that I'm going to talk about real quickly. And I realize that you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear Kevin. So I'm going to try to keep these comments as brief as possible. But also knowing that, like local organizations like Nomad Anglers, they have another, guide raffle that is also trying to help out some of the local guides. And in this week's raffle, Drew Rosema, which is another guide that works for Kevin, is part of the opportunity to win. So, it's just nice to see, Kevin's helping us. Different organizations are helping each other in kind of this really unusual time. So we sometimes get some feedback that we don't do a good enough job of letting everyone know what we're up to. And, there's been so many board members that have come before me that really have kind of set such a solid base for Schrems Trout Unlimited that have allowed us to kind of expand what we're doing into the Muskegon River watershed. And we really started a large scale temperature monitoring of the Muskegon River in 2018. It was years in the work to kind of get the plan in place, but we actually started collecting data in 2018 and it's set to end in 2021. However, it's likely going to be extended. So I'm going to just take a few moments to let you know what we're up to as far as that plan goes. So first, we started and I am not, I don't have a scientific background. However, I want you to know that as I'm talking through some of these things, I might need a little grace because I lack that scientific background. But my job as the conservation chair is really to kind of coordinate all of these activities and make sure that things are getting done. But the plan itself was, we planned it and implemented it with some experts in fisheries biology, as well as people that have their kind of their feelers, including Kevin on the Muskegon River. So, our goal was really to kind of figure out, the Muskegon River is a large and complex river, one that I love, and I know that many of you guys love as well. What's going on with the temperature? I mean, we had some temperature data, but not enough to say we really know what's going on in the Muskegon River. So our objectives to figure out what's going on in the river. Where are the sources of cold water? And that is so critical for the Muskegon River, especially in the summer. And then we're mapping those sources so that we know where they're at. And then what are the risks to some of those cold water resources? That is so huge because we need to figure out what are the risks so that we can also then come back with some recommendations on how to protect those really, really critical cold water refuges. And for those of you that have spent a lot of time on the Muskegon River, you know that the groundwater influence, especially during those summer months when that water temperature starts to raise, is so important for trout and trout survival in the Muskegon River. So what we're trying to do is really figure out, okay, where are those cold water refuges that we know are so important for trout? And we're talking about, for those of you that have spent some time on the Muskegon, and if you haven't, this would be important to know. There's all sorts of springs, there's seeps, there's cold water tributaries, and in the summer months and also in the winter months, those become critical components for trout in the Muskegon River. And what we're trying to do is just get the baseline data so that we know what's going on and can have a handle on that in the future moving forward. The other thing that would be, that we're looking to do is, this is just one of the many charts that we've compiled but we know that temperature tends to be really consistent in the spring and the fall across the river. However, in those summer months, we see a huge, wide-ranging, temperature fluctuations, and they're varied by area. And so those areas we're trying to identify what are the areas that need to be protected. And then also one of the other things that we're going to be looking to expand this temperature study is looking at temperature in the winter months, because it also is likely, and it's kind of becoming apparent, that those winter months for trout in the Muskegon maybe are just as important as those summer months when it comes to temperature, because those seeps and springs are also providing some refuge even in the coldest of times as they are in the warmest temperature as well. And the other thing is I need to let you guys know this is something that takes a lot of time to come together, and we have a lot of partners that are a huge part of this. And I would have to make sure that I thanked some of those partners. Certainly, from the very beginning, the Orvis shop in Grand Rapids, as well as Orvis corporate, were like huge in helping us just kind of getting this off the ground and running. The Fremont Foundation, as well as Trout Unlimited National, has contributed actual funds to help us continue this project, as well as Schrems as well. So every time that you support us, whether it's making a donation tonight or coming to our banquet, those funds go directly towards projects like this. And this is just one of the many projects we have currently going on. And then, last but not least, I need to give a special thanks to a few people. Dr. Mark Luttinen from Grand Valley State University has been huge in just helping us put the scientific background into a plan like this and make it feasible. Justin Wegner is also, studied under Dr. Mark Luttinen, graduated from Grand Valley State, and he has been kind of the organizer as far as getting and collecting in the actual data. And also all along the way, the Muskegon River Watershed Assembly and their executive director, Marty Holgren, has been super helpful with this project. And then, last but not least, Kevin is not only doing this for us tonight, which I'm really looking forward to, but he has been an integral part of helping us, not just, locating some of these areas that we need to kind of look at, but then also giving us access to his time, his boat, and helping us place some of those loggers. And Jay Allen as well as somebody who has donated a lot of time to this project. So I'm going to kick it back over to Kevin, because that's why we're here. Kevin, we really appreciate your time in doing this tonight. Certainly you have such a intimate knowledge of the Muskegon River. Those of you that that have seen not only your expertise in fishing, but your photography continues to amaze me every time I see something pop up on Instagram or Facebook. I'm just blown away at the quality of the images that you're taking, and you have a passion for the Muskegon River, and I'm glad that you could share that with us tonight.
All right, I think it's my turn. Can everybody hear me? I am really happy to do this tonight. I'm happy to help Schrems, and I'm glad I can bring you guys kind of a trout primer while we're all kind of waiting for things to start moving again. And hopefully this program's something really enjoyable that you can look forward to fishing and enjoying our great natural resources. I'm going to share with you a slide program. It's going to have some photography, insects.
Yeah, Kevin, if you want to take control or share your screen.
You bet. I'm going to do that. Sorry. All right. Well, I tell you what I'm going to do.
There we go. We see your screen now.
All right. And I have my program up. So this program is entitled Return to the Muskegon. The Muskegon is waiting, and a lot of us are waiting to fish and waiting to use our boats again. And I just wanted to share some kind of general knowledge about the Muskegon, tell you a little bit about myself and my life, and hopefully you get a little different perspective of the river. Here's a little bit about this program. It's going to be pretty simple. This is the only text you'll really see in this whole program. It's mostly a photo essay. I'm going to talk to you just to give you a little introduction and show you some of the photography I've been doing in the watershed recently. And then I'll take you through the insect hatches that are useful from my perspective. There's some that I don't pay much attention to at all. And then I'm going to talk to you in depth about bait fish, something that I kind of have a passion for. And I just hope that you guys can all get something out of this program. Since the stay-at-home order, it's been acceptable to go out into the woods and do things. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to learn parts of the resource that I've never seen before. And a lot of times I end up seeing some pretty cool things. This morning, I saw a mother fox feeding her kits, which was pretty spectacular. A few days ago, I was walking along the river, and I had a couple days where I really wished I had packed a rod in with me, but I had a long lens, and I spent a lot of time photographing trout that were rising for stoneflies. And I'll talk to you a bit about that, but there's actually been some pretty good dry fly fishing, and it's accessible to you wading or with a drift type boat right now. So if you have the ambition, and it's not just the Muskegon, it's the other rivers around too. And this is a picture of a brown trout that was doing a pretty impressive head tail rise while eating early brown stones. So, and I'll get to that in a little bit. I've been spending a lot of time in some of the swamps that actually drain into the Muskegon. It might seem like kind of a weird thing to do. But one thing I really like to do is photograph waterfowl. And a lot of days I've been sitting out waiting for the weather to break to get a great photo, and I'd wait through some snow, which is really unusual for April, and I'd end up seeing something really beautiful or spectacular. And the river system as a whole amazes me. There's just so much to it. We have many tributaries, but there's many lakes that drain into the Muskegon. And there's a lot of national forest in the area. So there's just a lot of cool places to explore. I've had the opportunity over, the 20 plus years of guiding now to see some pretty amazing things. And I've been trying more and more to capture them just because I enjoy sharing them in programs like this. This was an eagle that I saw hunting one day that killed a duck. And in order to kill the duck, it actually stood upright in the water while it pushed the duck down into the bottom. It was nature at its kind of finest, but also kind of a cruel moment, but really spectacular and beautiful to watch. But I spend a lot of time in the winter because there's not much else to photograph. I'll photograph a lot of the diving ducks that come to the river and to the open water. And this is a goldeneye from Croton Pond in the middle of the winter, right where the road goes over the juncture between the two lakes. Some really cool moments over the years. For years I wanted to photograph an otter, and I couldn't seem to get close to one. I'd see them from a distance and they'd always be wary. I'm not exactly a subtle person. So anyways, one day I was waiting in front of a creek mouth and fishing away for trout, and I started hearing a crunching noise behind me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And it was early October, and I pretty soon realized that this otter was crunching on a salmon behind me, and I managed to get some good frames. But anyways, it's always amazing to me about how all the different animals are tied together and how many of them depend on fish. This is a northern water snake that caught a fish. I believe it's a goby that caught in the rocks. I see all kinds of different creatures feeding on fish along the river. Few of them have real impact on our fishing, but there's a couple that actually do. Great blue herons are a spectacular fish, or a spectacular bird, but they're also eating machines. Sometimes they're eating things that you're happy to see them eating, like I'll see them eating a whole lampreys sometimes, which is what this image is of, a great blue heron eating a sea lamprey. But unfortunately, there's other times where herons aren't particularly useful. And one of the places that they have some pretty expensive fish dinners is right in front of our boat launches. And there's days where I see herons eating 5 an hour and I see 5 herons in front of the launch. So doing the math, they can do a bit of destruction. So I always hope that those trout leave the boat launches soon, because otherwise they're going to get eaten, pretty quickly. But a lot of birds of prey also depend on the various fish we have. This is an osprey. This one actually has a pretty big rainbow trout. It was a trout that I'd seen rising several days, and I couldn't get it to take my fly. And then lo and behold, I heard a big splash behind me, and this osprey had taken it out of the way for me. So, but generally speaking, ospreys eat a lot of trash fish like suckerfish and things like that. But one bird that can really change our fishing a lot is these guys. And you can see his serrated teeth. These are fish-eating machines. These are red-breasted mergansers and common mergansers. And what happens in the Great Lakes is that we have some years where we have a really cold winter. Now, this winter wouldn't have qualified, but when we have a really cold winter, the birds that eat fish out on Lake Michigan will come to the river. And usually the trout can kind of fend for themselves. But if we have a year where we have really low water and we have a really cold winter, it'll bring these things into the river and they'll eat the fish. And some of you guys might remember 4 or 5 years ago when our trout fishing was really bad. And I really believe that this is what caused the problem here. I love birds, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should kill the birds, but it's an interesting thing that if we have the right conditions, our trout fishing can really pay a heavy price with the birds. So I'm going to start talking to you about the subject of this talk, which is our trout species. And I'm going to touch a little bit on the migratory fish as well. The Muskegon is very healthy right now with trout. We had a good winter for the trout. The brown trout strain that the DNR is giving us, the Sturgeon River strain, is really doing well, and we should have some really nice trout for when things start happening this spring. Our rainbow population is stable. I think our brown trout are really kind of taking over as far as being the dominant big fish as far as our trout species, but we also are at the end of our steelhead run. And this is a steelhead in one of our local tiny streams. And you can see that she's in virtually no water whatsoever. And a lot of the successful natural reproduction is in these tiny, tiny little streams. And what happens is the steelhead will go up these little streams when the water's high. And sometimes these little streams will form waterfalls. The streams might virtually not have any water at all when the water is at a normal level, but when we have runoff, it becomes a big enough stream for the steelhead to go up. And the steelhead will go up and they'll reproduce. And because what water these streams have is very cold and very clean, this is where a lot of our wild fish come from when we're talking about steelhead. And that's why these stream monitors that Pete was talking about are so very important, because we desperately need the cold water to have an impact on our river system. Now, it's even more important this year that we have this reproduction in these small streams, because one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that there was not any egg take this year. So next spring, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think we're going to have very many steelhead planted in the state of Michigan. So we're going to need the natural reproduction. So if you didn't catch and release before of steelhead, if you catch some yet this spring, it's a good idea to practice that in any of our watersheds right now. Eventually, those little tiny streams get so low that the steelhead have to leave, and so they quickly spawn. And as the water drops really, really quickly, they just get sucked right on out of the small streams and into the mainstream. And then they work their way back down the river if they've completed their spawning mission. So that's where we get a lot of our recruitment. It's pretty amazing to watch. I always thought that the vast majority of the spawning was in the mainstream of the Muskegon, but just about every little tiny creek that we have, if it gets enough water in it, we'll have spawning steelhead in the spring. And an interesting side note is that most of those little tiny streams also have viable brook trout populations. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our insect population. Muskegon is very, very rich in insects. You know, the parts of the Muskegon that most people trout fish are just the tip of the iceberg as far as insects go. Or the tributaries to the Muskegon have some pretty fantastic catches as well. So one of the very first insects we see late in the winter is early black stone, or tiny winter stone, I'm sorry. And this one actually has a mite on it. So if you can imagine how tiny this thing is, it's actually smaller than your fingernail, but it's one of the first insects that we see hatching. A lot of times it's so cold that as soon as these insects hatch, they start mating. So a lot of times their skin hasn't even dried. That's why the bottom one here is a kind of pale milky color. Trout will feed on these to some degree, but they're very, very small. At the same time, during the cold times of the winter, we have some really good midge hatches. And if you do a lot of nymph fishing in the Muskegon, you know that one of the very best nymphs in the river is imitating the little red worms that we have on the bottom of the river and some of the other midge larvae, which eventually become these midges. Interestingly, we did have some dry fly fishing this winter with the midges, which is something I hadn't seen in quite a few years. So, but they're a very vital part, kind of the bottom end of our food chain. But they're extremely abundant through the whole year. The colors of the midges vary through the year. The ones in the winter tend to be olive or a darker color. We have some bright green ones in the summer. We have white ones in the summer. So they're always around and also always a valuable part of our resource. Things get really interesting towards the end of winter. You know, the river's been inactive all winter. You know, there's a lot of life in the river in the winter, but a lot of it is the same life day after day. Basically, if you figure out a fly that works in January, it'll probably work in February and early March, because not a whole lot has changed over that course of time. But then suddenly we start getting this eruption of life, and one of the first things that really triggers the fish in the mainstream of the river is the early black stones, which start to hatch, and they swim very awkwardly towards shore, like this one is doing. And they're just trigger all the life in the river, and suddenly a river that you don't think has that many trout, or doesn't have, in your mind you might not think it has that many steelhead, suddenly they're all very active, and you kind of get a feeling for what's really available in the river system. Eventually these will lay their eggs on the surface of the river. They hatch by crawling out of the water, and they only come back when they're blown into the river or when they're laying their eggs. So, and then they die, and they lay on the surface of the river, and a lot of times they become really good food source for the trout. The nymphs are always a good food source for the trout, but the adults are as well. A dead giveaway to any type of insect activity in the winter is whether you see a lot of small birds hopping along the bank, because in the winter it's hard to come by protein for a lot of birds. So anytime there's any type of a hatch, be it midges or stoneflies, the birds will flock to the river and they'll feed along the shore. And so if you see birds feeding along the shore, there's probably some biological activity happening. That's a great thing. So right alongside of the early black stones, but just slightly later, are the early brownstones. And early brownstones, like the early black ones, will crawl to the edge of the river, and they generally will climb out of the water and hide underneath something, usually a log or a rock or some dead leaves. And they wait until their body dries out. And once their body dries out, they split their skin and they pop out as an adult insect. And that's what's happening here. This adult is struggling to break free from the skin, the husk of his nymphal shell. So anyways, you can see that this insect is kind of struggling and the shell is kind of dried out. So now he's trying to break free. And eventually, though he looks yellow right now, he'll dry to be kind of a brownish colored insect. So, and if you were to go to the Muskegon River right now, in the next few days, this would be the primary thing that you'd want to use. You'd want to use an early brown stone. And when I was on the river the other day, it was these early brown stones that were bringing up some really huge trout. And I was lucky enough to see a really big fish. And, like I've been telling people, I didn't have the technology with me to actually catch the fish, but I had the technology to capture them on my camera. So I used a really fast shutter speed, which made the picture kind of grainy, but I got to see this big trout doing some really awesome head tail rises and leaving a spectacular splash on the water. So it was pretty awesome. So right now, even if you have the ambition to go, there's some dry fly fishing available, and it can be pretty good, pretty good. In the springtime, when you're nymph fishing, sometimes fishing stones or some of the other types, you catch some weird things because there's a variety of fish in there trying to spawn. Spring is the spawning time for a lot of strange things. And one of the things that migrates into the river that I always think is strange, and a lot of them live in the river year round, is a fish called a quillback. It's like if you caught a permit and you painted it with the scales of a carp. It's a really deep fish, and they fight extremely well. They just don't take a fly very often. So kind of a bonus fish that you catch every once in a while. Another strange thing that you see spawning in the spring is gar pike. As soon as the steelhead are done and the suckers are done spawning, you'll see a lot of gar pike spawning, even in the faster gravel, and that's always strange. But at the same time as the stoneflies are coming to an end, we start seeing a lot of crane fly larvae in the river. They're basically just large blobs of protein. They don't look like much. If you looked at a crane fly larva in the water, I took some photos of them, and honestly, they don't really look like much in a photo. It's hard to take a dramatic picture of a crane fly larva. So I just thought I'd show you a photo of an adult. But there's times where you can use crane fly larva both for trout and for steelhead and be very effective. It's usually during the month of April where it's really, really good towards the end of April. As we head into May, one of the first mayflies that you see is called a March brown. And it's a spectacular, beautiful, elegant looking mayfly. But unfortunately, the trout just don't seem to eat it very often. So, but I've seen over the years, I've seen some pretty big fish taking these off the surface, but in general, they're not a big menu item for the trout on the Muskegon River. Right around this same time in early May, we start seeing other things that are really awesome. One of the native fish that they're working pretty hard to restore in the Muskegon is the lake sturgeon. And one day I was in my boat and I was fortunate to see 30 of them in one riffle. And they were quite huge and quite oblivious to my presence. So I stuck an underwater camera in the river, and you can see these fish. Generally, the males are the smaller ones and the females are the bigger. But they're a native fish and they're making a pretty strong comeback. So, and I don't see any downside to having them in the river. They're just a really cool thing to see. And I just thought I'd throw that in there. But as we head into mid-May, the first really significant hatch as far as fishing and guiding is concerned is the early Tan Caddis. They're a lot of times called Mother's Day caddis. But they're Tan Caddis species, typically a size 16 to 18, and they can provide some pretty good fishing. Typically, that good fishing is concentrated around Croton Dam. So if looking through to the year, a lot of times it's Mother's Day caddis. And it'll hatch again in the very similar species in the fall. The Muskegon once was a very, very noted steelhead caddis stream, but the zebra mussels competed really well with the caddis, and as a result, the caddis population dropped. And we still have caddis fishing all summer. However, It's just not quite what it used to be. And once we get past the caddis, the first real hatch that we have that really gets anglers excited is the sulfur mayflies, which hatch. Now, sulfurs are typically a daytime hatcher, a lot of time on a cloudy day. They'll hatch in the riffles. They provide daytime dry fly fishing and some pretty exciting fishing. A lot of times they'll be hatching right around the same areas where the steelhead had been spawning. And so you get some really good daytime fishing for these sulfurs. This is a female sulfur. When you look at mayflies, she's got a hitchhiker on her shoulder there. But if you look at mayflies, a female mayfly typically has a very small head, and male mayflies, such as this male sulfur, typically have very big eyes. And the reason being is that they're looking up to the sky to find a mate. And so you have these different variances in what they appear like, but they're both the same insect. And the pattern that you're tying to imitate these really doesn't have much difference. So as you head a little later into May, typically by about the 15th to 20th of May, we start having gray drakes. And this is a picture of a gray drake nymph. Gray drakes typically live in vegetation in the Muskegon River. And a lot of times when I used to look for them, I'd read that they lived in typically gravelly areas. And the truth is that if you're seining for gray drake nymphs, you'll find an awful lot of them in vegetation along the shore areas. So eventually gray drakes hatch. Their actual hatching process is somewhat mysterious, and for all practical purposes, we fish them as a spinner when they return to the river, and they lay their eggs. So anyways, when they die as spinners, we have some fantastic evening fishing, and the gray drake spinner fall has long been one of the famous things on the river. When you're tying gray drake patterns, I always tell people don't be afraid to put a little hint of flash in the pattern. One thing that I always put in my gray drake patterns in the tail is some gray UV crystal flash. Works amazingly well. When you look at a gray drake in this picture or any photo, they're not actually gray. They're actually brown drakes. I think they named them gray drakes because brown was already taken. So anyways, when you're tying gray drakes, use a little sparkle and tie some brown in them. Really interesting thing about gray drakes is that they are drawn to heat. And so a lot of times if you see a tremendous amount of gray drakes forming a column above your body, seems like a great thing. You're like, man, this is really happening. But the truth is that when you see that big column of gray drakes above your body, it's getting too cold for them. And the only gray drakes that are probably landing on the water are the ones that your fly rod is knocking down, which depending on how much you're moving might be a lot. So, but anyways, it's kind of an interesting thing that gray drakes are drawn to heat. So, and if you look at the photo on the left, you can see the column right above that gentleman. So a lot of times the gray drake spinner falls are so profuse that when I get home the next day from a guide trip, the bottom of my boat crunches when I walk on it. And my fly box is actually full of gray drakes. And when I woke up and was actually tying gray drakes the next morning, I looked in my fly box, and lo and behold, it was pretty easy to imitate them when I had a box full of them. So after you move out of the time of the year with the gray drakes, we have another really cool insect that emerges. It's one of my favorites. It's called an Isonychia. It's a very large, clumsy mayfly. When it hatches, it's kind of an olivish gray color. It used to be called the slate drake because it's such a big gray fly. And it becomes what's called a white-gloved howdy as it gets to be an adult and a spinner. Now and this is a white-gloved howdy. Now the real value of a Isonychia isn't the actual mayfly itself, but a lot of times it's the nymph, because as the nymph breaks free from the bottom, it's a swimming nymph, and once it gets into the process of hatching, it's pretty slow and clumsy, and the trout know this, so they really feed on them. So when you see this type of nymph or this type of mayfly on the water, it's a really good time to imitate the nymphs and their emergers with wet flies along the surface of the river. We use a lot of wet flies in the Muskegon. Some of them imitate mayflies, some of them imitate fry. This is a classic pattern called the Queen of the Waters. This one we use to imitate a lot of different things, but fry and also sulfurs are a really good imitation. But when it comes to wet flies, all you need to do is imitate the size of the fly and the body color, and maybe add a little sparkle, and you'll have a good formula for success. Deer hair, which can actually move the water and add some feeling to your fly, can also make it a more effective pattern. And you can fish these wet flies with a wide variety of different gear. The most common thing to use is a single hand rod with a sinking leader at the end of your floating line, basically the same floating line you use for dry fly fishing. If you don't use a sinking leader, you'll typically catch a lot of trout, but if you add a sinking leader to the end, you'll catch a lot of trout plus some big ones. So, and you can also, this fish here was actually caught with a lightweight switch rod and a light sink tip, and that's another way you can do it. Now, this varies a lot from steelhead fishing, where you would, with steelhead fishing, you would always fish a dead drift for all practical purposes. But with trout fishing, you always want to add a twitch to your presentation. Sometimes you want to twitch a lot. Sometimes you want it to twitch more than it's actually swinging. So adding action to a wet fly and swinging it across the river is a really good formula for success in the Muskegon River. As we head towards later in the summer, there's other insects that are quite prominent. The trout do eat them, but I don't spend a lot of time with them. This is a light cahill. The trout will feed on them in certain instances, but they're not as big as they are on some other rivers as far as popularity with the fish. They do seem to get eaten by everything else. This is a really weird and interesting creature called a mantid fly. And I never even knew such a thing existed, but it's a dead ringer for a paper wasp, except it's got claws like a mantis, and pretty amazing thing to see this thing chomping on a light cahill on the side of the river. As we head towards the end of summer, there's a couple more really good hatches, but the main one is blue-winged olives. And much like the midges, they're a very small insect. So you can look at the life along the river and start to understand what's happening when you see this. A lot of times, the first precursor to a really good blue-winged olive hatch is dark skies, right around weather. But a cloudy day is definitely going to produce more blue-winged olives than a sunny day. You can also keep your eye along the edge of the river. There's certain birds that feed just on these blue-winged olives, or feed mostly on the blue-winged olives, I guess you could say. And one that you see a lot in the summer is cedar waxwings. And if you see these flying over the river a lot, but you don't see the insect that they're eating, usually they're feeding on blue-winged olives. And it's a pretty good idea to start looking at around for very small rises, which can sometimes be big fish, because these are one of the giveaways. You'll also see other birds feeding on them. This is a spotted sandpiper that was feeding on really tiny, probably size 20 or 22 blue-winged olives. That bird looks like a giant compared to the olive, but the later you go in the summer, the smaller those olives can be. As the water temperature gets above 70, we typically stop fishing for trout in the Muskegon, but we will fish some of the smaller tributaries. And, whether it be Bigelow Creek or Penoyer or Tamarack Creek or the Little Muskegon River, they all have really rich insect life. And some of the insects that you see on those tributaries are insects that you don't see on the mainstream of the Muskegon, such as this brown drake here on Tamarack Creek. One part of the insect life that's really overlooked on the Muskegon is the damselflies, and the Muskegon has a tremendous damselfly population. The nymphs are everywhere, so whether you're smallmouth fishing or trout fishing, it's good to keep in mind that these are a type of food that the trout will key on, and some of their nymphs live on the bottom on rocks, just like mayfly and stonefly nymphs. So they're worth noting and taking a look at as you're doing your exploration of the river. The Muskegon's not an awesome terrestrial river because it's so wide, but there are times and places when hoppers come into play, especially on the tributary rivers, the Little Muskegon and Tamarack Creek. Hoppers can definitely come into play, and you can catch some really nice trout throwing generic hopper imitations. There's other terrestrials that occasionally come into play in the Muskegon. This is a cicada bumping out of its shell. I did a time lapse with him. But on a windy day, sometimes you'll have cicadas in the river. Now, I don't catch trout with those, but I have had some pretty good fishing for smallmouth over the years with cicada patterns when that's randomly happened. As we head into fall, insects start to become less and less into the picture for a fishing guide like me. But there's always other types of fishing to be done, and there's great streamer fishing on the Muskegon. This is a really good guide named Jack Ford, who's out fishing on his own, and you can see the big yellow streamer he's throwing. I am going to talk to you at length for the second half of my program here about the different minnows in the river, and I hope you guys can, it's one of the things that I'm kind of passionate about as far as looking around for these things. So one thing you have to understand about trout is that they're not too much different than the other predator fish in the rivers, as provided that they're in their comfort range for temperatures. So what they're going to look for as a predatory fish, especially brown trout, is they're going to look for an ambush point. And this brown trout in this image is actually in the same spot that I found a smallmouth bass in during the summer, and that I'll find a steelhead in the fall. So basically what I'm saying is, if you find a spot that has predator fish in it at one time of the year, especially big predator fish, chances are at other times of the year, you're going to find another type of big predator fish there when the water temperature is optimum for that predator. So keep an eye out for these really good lies. In the Muskegon, it's a little different than other rivers, whereas some rivers you'd strictly fish the bank when you're fishing a streamer pattern. In the Muskegon, and also in some of the other big rivers like the Manistee, you'll find trout a lot of times right in the center of the river. So don't always, if there's 3 boats in front of you and they're all doing the same thing, don't hesitate to fish to the middle of the river as well as the sides on the Muskegon as you go down. One of the first bait fish that become valuable in the Muskegon, and they're valuable in general, is king salmon. King salmon will hatch as early as February. Some years they don't hatch until May. Because of our warm winter this year, the king salmon actually hatched maybe as early as January. I started seeing a few in February. It's always a good sign. Our river is completely dependent on wild king salmon in order to sustain our population of salmon. And though I'm not a big salmon fisherman, in a lot of ways, they are still really a valuable part of our resource. They provide a lot of food in terms of their eggs and their fry and smolt. As they die, their bodies become food for a lot of different animals and fish in the river. So they're just a really valuable species. One of the neat things that's going to happen this year in the next couple of years is that we now have, in addition to king salmon, we're going to have coho salmon. And for guys like me that like to swing flies, or if you like to throw streamers, you know, coho salmon typically will take a well-presented fly a little bit better than a king. So it's a pretty exciting thing to have a bonus species in our river. Soon after the king salmon start working their way down river and grow larger and larger, we have another fry that hatches, and that's the steelhead themselves. Now, the steelhead, they're in a little bit more of a predicament than the salmon. The salmon can leave at any time. They're heading down to the big lake. They've been alive for a few months, so they've already put on a little bit of size, but the steelhead are really built to stay in the river for a year. And that's why a big river with like the Muskegon, if the temperatures don't stay cool enough, and that's again why those feeder creeks are so important. If those feeder creeks don't sustain these fish, then we don't have very many wild fish coming out of the mainstream a few years down the road. So anyways, very important, these little fish. unfortunately, a lot of times what you see is in the summer, these little fry will, as soon as the water temperature hits 70 degrees, you'll see them become pretty disoriented if you watch them. And it's when they become disoriented, they'll kind of move away from the shelter of shore. And the bigger fish, the trout that are older than a year that can take the warm or wet water, the smallmouth bass, the walleye, they all gorge on these fry. And so, a pretty small percentage of these survive out of the mainstream of the river. And they provide great food for the steelhead that are here in late April and into May. They provide food for the trout, and you can tie flies that imitate these. Typically for the steelhead, you're fishing them right along the bottom, or you're slowly swinging them. Whereas for the trout, you're usually using an active presentation where you're swinging it and twitching the fly. So one of the common ways to present a fry pattern that I use a lot in the spring is I'll run a fry pattern as a streamer in front of a much bigger, typically a sculpin pattern or a darter pattern. And a lot of times the fish will come out and they'll chase the steelhead or salmon fry imitation, but then they'll turn and they'll eat the bigger pattern behind it. It's almost like an attractor, even though it's shaped a lot like a natural pattern. So after the steelhead become a little less consequential, after that water temperature is starting to come up and the steelhead fry disperse, there's still other fry in the river that are really valuable. And one of the fry that's really valuable is the sucker fry. We have millions and millions and millions of sucker fry, and it's probably the most valuable trout fishing imitation in the river, and yet it's pretty heavily ignored. So this is what sucker fry look like along the edge of the river. If you're ever by the side of the river, they're typically in clouds by the majillions, and the fish will feed on them. You notice that they have just a faint purple hue. If you make your flies a little bit purple or a little bit lavender color, that's a good starting point for imitating sucker fry. Now you see this picture, those aren't steelhead or salmon spawning, those are sucker spawning. It used to be one of the big secrets of the Muskegon that you could go and catch big trout behind the suckers. It's not really a secret anymore, so I'm showing you the photo. But this is some red horse suckers spawning. A lot of times you'll find big trout right in amongst them, and you'll typically indicator fish behind these fish, and the success rate can be really good for big fish. Now, this just to give you an example, this is what it looks like when trout are feeding behind suckers. It can be a real bonanza. There's actually a hierarchy where the bigger fish stay towards the front. And that's a beautiful thing, because if you're going to catch a fish, that's the one that a lot of times you'll end up catching the big fish versus the smaller, because they're defending their position. So anyways, keep an eye on those suckers. There's several species that can be really productive for nymph fishing around. As we head to the end of the sucker runs, there's a lot of native bait fish that come into play for our fishing. And this is a rainbow darter. Rainbow darters by mass are one of the most abundant fish in the Muskegon River, and everything feeds on them. In the spring, they're this brilliant, beautiful color, probably one of the most beautiful fish in our river systems. But they're one of several species of darters that the fish key on. This is a log perch, which is a very long, extended darter. I catch some trout on these. It's a great smallmouth bait in the river system. They can grow up to 4 or 5 inches long, so they're a sizable bait. And this is a Johnny darter. And Johnny darters, you can always identify them by looking at the side of them, and they've got basically a W pattern on the side of them. Now in the fall, when the salmon start spawning, there is a tremendous amount of 1 to 1.5 inch long Johnny darters in the river. And I'm convinced that a lot of times when you're fishing a hex nymph around the salmon and you're catching steel-headed trout, I think a lot of times the fish are mistaking that hex nymph for a Johnny darter. And these darter patterns are good all through the summer for the variety of fish. And then in the winter, they catch some really big brown trout. This is a big brown at the end of March. Great fish. And they'll also be really good for the migratory fish, like this big lake run brown trout. And darter patterns are very simple to tie. They're a bottom dwelling fish like sculpins and gobies, which I'm going to talk about. The main advantage to fishing a darter pattern is that it's a thin fly, and sculpins and gobies are a really wide fly. So when you're tying a darter pattern, you can tie something that sinks really, really well, because you can put on some lead eyes and that narrow fly will cut right down through the water, whereas a sculpin or a goby pattern is going to be really, really bulky. Now this is a sculpin resting on the bottom of the river. I could talk about sculpins for quite a while because they're such a great bait fish. Everything eats them. Sculpin's only defense, a lot of animals have a defense. Sculpin's only defense is just its tremendous camouflage, and you can see it kind of in the middle bottom of the stream or screen. Now sculpins, they don't have a swim bladder, which means they can only go off the bottom for short distances before they sink down again. So though they can go extremely fast, they can only go for a short distance, and then they sink, and then they go fast, and then they sink. And so if you're fishing a fly to imitate them, a lot of times that strip and pause method, strip and pause, is a really good way to fish a sculpin. This is what a sculpin looks like from underneath. And if you're tying flies to imitate sculpins or any bait fish, most bait fish are lighter colored underneath. And so you have to keep in mind how you're presenting. Like, for example, if I'm tying a fly in the middle of the winter to fish right along the bottom, and the fish are seeing it at eye level, they'd be looking at the side of a sculpin. So I'd tie that fly the color of the bottom, basically the color of the sculpin's camouflage. But if I'm fishing a sculpin and I'm stripping it along with a sink tip, the fish is going to be seeing the belly, and they'd expect that to be more of a yellow or cream color. And so when you're tying your flies and you're making your sculpin patterns, it's always important to think of how you're going to be presenting it, because typically if you're presenting it on the bottom, you want to tie it a darker color, whereas if you're fishing it towards the surface, you want to imitate the belly, which is the lighter color. Sculpins are really cool looking fish. They can grow to be 4 or 5 inches long. This is an adult sculpin and its friend. But again, they vary a lot in color. So you can look at the bottom of the river is the best advice I can give you if you're imitating sculpins near the bottom. And that'll tell you what color to tie. The Muskegon, they're typically an olive or a tan color, sometimes a dark brown, depending on what kind of rocks they're sitting by. But always look at the bottom. That's my advice for fishing sculpins. And these are just a couple bottom, when I'm fishing the bottom for steelhead, this is an example of a couple sculpin patterns that I'd use. And sculpins are deadly on any big predator fish. You can use sculpins year-round for game fish. They're kind of a fallback bait. That is to say, they're not usually like fish feeding in a frenzy on sculpins, but there's always a fish somewhere that'll eat a sculpin. So it's always good to have that earth tone fly, that olive and tan, olive and brown color, that'll catch a fish when the fish are being really picky. Another fish that is super, super abundant is the round goby. It's actually displacing some of our native fish. But part of the reason that you're seeing such really big, heavy set brown trout and smallmouth bass coming out of the Muskegon the last few years is because gobies have moved into the river and become so prominent. This is what a little goby looks like. This one's about 1.5 inches long. They have eyes on top of their head. They're shaped very similar to a sculpin, but unlike a sculpin, they don't have the camouflage in the same way. And they typically survive just by sheer mass reproduction. They'll stay on top of rocks. They'll stay out in the open. But they reproduce like crazy, and that's why they displace some of the native fish. But all the brown trout will eat these. Your smallmouth bass just thrive on these. Walleye, northern pike, everything eats gobies. So they've become, for invasive species, they've become an important part of our food chain, and they actually eat zebra mussels. So it's a weird scenario where we have one invasive species eating another. And I got a couple more short sections to this program. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about shiners. Shiners are a very important food species in the river. On the bottom, you'll see a horny head chub that's right in the bottom of the river. or bottom of the screen. And what happens is chubs will dig beds in the river just like a steelhead would or a salmon, except on a much smaller scale. And they get done building this really nice bed by moving rocks around. And all of a sudden, a big school of these common shiners will come in and they'll take over the bed and they'll spawn there. Now, if you notice, I'm really close to these shiners when I'm taking this video. And these fish are really easy prey for a predator because once they start spawning, not only is there a lot of them, but they don't really care. So a lot of times what you'll find in mid-May and early June is that you'll catch a lot of big predator fish on kind of copper and rosy colored streamers, and that's because these common shiners are spawning. And in that same area, especially right around Croton Dam and down towards Carmichael Flats and Henning Park, you'll find these really beautiful rosy face shiners spawning in the early summer. Now, rosy face shiners are different than the shiners that I just showed you. Those common shiners will stay kind of close to the bottom, but rosy face shiners tend to be a little higher in the water column. And you'll find that tying kind of a tan and red fly towards early summer is a great way to catch trout and, again, smallmouth bass. Because as you head towards that kind of intermediate time, you start catching smallmouth mixed in with the trout. Probably my favorite bait fish of the summer is called the spot fin shiner. And spot fin shiners, they grow to be a pretty big shiner, but the thing that's a little different about them is that by July, most of the other bait fish in the river are done spawning, but these are spawning like crazy, typically right around brush. So if you're fishing around timber towards the early to mid part of the summer, early in the summer for trout, or towards the mid part of the summer for smallmouth bass, imitating these guys is a really good way to go. And they're almost always kind of a grayish peacock color with some yellow over top. So usually I tie the body gray and then I use some yellow holographic flash to imitate this minnow. And as you head towards late summer, big shiner minnows become the main forage in the river, and they turn kind of a olive and yellow color. And again, by late summer, almost everything's done spawning. Most of the shiners actually become what you'd think shiners look like. They're going to be very shiny. They're going to be kind of a yellowish silver color and olive on top, and they become a primary forage species, not only for the resident fish, but as the migratory fish come into our lower parts of our river, and all the weed beds are dying at the same time. So the cover that a lot of these shiners were hiding in suddenly becomes a really bad place for them to be, and the bigger fish will feed on them really heavily. So as steelhead and brown trout are coming into the river, this is a really good fish to have in the back of your mind. And these are bread and butter fish, or bread and butter patterns for the game fish of summer, which for me are usually smallmouth bass. And one more shiner species here. These are the pasta piranhas. But along any sandy area late in the summer, if you rinse your plate off with your clients, you'll have these sand shiners attack your pasta. And anyways, these are super abundant little fish that can be imitated with a tan minnow imitation with a little silver underneath it. And if you go to the boat launch even now and you look down and you see a bunch of tan colored minnows, it's one of the most common things that's there. If you go to Thornapple Boat Launch or Henning Park, is these sand shiners, and they're always on the menu of both the trout and the other game fish that are available. At the end of summer, going into September, there's other options, and some of our tributary streams before the season closes has some really beautiful brook trout in pre-spawn colors. And if you want a little interesting diversion late in the summer, if you want to get away, these smaller streams are a really fun place. There's certain streams that flow into the Muskegon where you could go out and you could catch a brook trout, a rainbow trout, and a brown trout, and maybe even a smallmouth bass all in the same sitting. It's pretty neat, pretty cool. So I've got just a little bit more to go. I want to talk to you about the crustaceans we have in the Muskegon. If you can't get anything to bite on any of the things that I've talked about before this, one thing that you can fish every day of the year in the river, especially if the water's clear, is a scud pattern. And scuds come in a variety of different colors. They're commonly in the Muskegon tide, gray or olive or tan. But if you fish them in the winter, you'll find a lot of orange and olive scuds. We usually tie them in a bright orange, and it's a very deadly thing. So basically, as a backup plan to everything that I've said in this program, you can carry a scud in your pocket. You can also carry some other generic nymphs, for example, a brassy or a simple midge pattern. And you can catch fish just about every day. And some of the great nymph fishermen on the Muskegon River do just that by imitating things like scuds. Oops. And one other thing yet is that the river is absolutely choked full of crayfish. Now, if you ever go to fish crayfish and you're tying flies and you see these beautiful patterns that have big, huge claws on them, just kind of forget about those claws, especially if you're going to use it for trout. What the fish really key on is those antennae that are at the front of a crayfish. And so rather than trying to imitate these big claws, just use a clump of deer hair and imitate those antennae that come out of the front of the crayfish. And trout in particular are a lot more selective about their crayfish. They either prefer a small crayfish or a crayfish with no claws or a soft shell crayfish. This is a soft shell crayfish. It doesn't look a lot different. It's just more gelatinous, more jelly-like than your typical crayfish. But they'll be really selective. So you want to tie crayfish that are small, crayfish that are soft looking, and the trout will be a lot more interested in those. If you tie a crayfish pattern that looks like a humongous armored tank, chances are you won't catch very many fish with that crayfish. So, and just kind of parting, I hope you guys got something out of this program. Just kind of looking towards the future and hoping that we can all have a great time enjoying this awesome resource. So thank you guys very much. This is another trout I took a picture of a couple days ago. I hope you enjoyed the program.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. Hey, we're gonna unmute everybody and you can give Kevin a good shout out.
What's that?
Round of applause.
So much, Kev.
Great job, Kevin.
Yeah,
Yep. Thanks, Kev.
Kevin.
want to go fishing.
Yeah.
Rest of the-
Welcome.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
Keeping up tinsel.
Yeah.
Kevin, thank you very
Hey, and if you want to ask any questions, we can probably have a little bit of time to do that. I can unmute folks, or you can put them into the chat session. I can read them off. Either way, I'm going to unmute Kevin, Lance as well, just in case. Kevin, are you still there?
I'm here.
Yeah, okay. Hey, there's a question from Greg. He says, well done and thank you. I'd be curious to get your perspective on how far downstream the viable and responsible trout fishing is on the Muskegon outside of the hot months, such as outside of
Sure.
late June and August.
That is a really good question. Typically, for really good trout fishing, the cutoff is typically maybe a mile below Newaygo. But viable trout fishing probably goes past Anderson Flats just a little bit. Basically, you have about 14 or 15 miles of trout water. Now, that being said, you can go below Anderson Flats, and if there's a big spinner fall, there's a very small trout population, but some big trout down there. So if you want adventure, you might float a couple mile between trout, but you might find a really big trout down there. So the answer to your question is basically Newaygo or a mile below Newaygo, and viable trout fishing to Anderson Flats, which is more marginal. And then once you get past that, if you have a big hatch, go for it. But
Thanks. We've got another question, I believe, from Dallas. Dallas Richards, he asks, any other tributaries you can recommend?
well, there's several really good ones that I can think of offhand. The Bigelow Creek is pretty well known, has some good access. Actually, one of the Trout Unlimited chapters did some good work up by 56th Street there. But Tamarack Creek is awesome. The Little Muskegon is awesome. The Little Muskegon sits in the shadow of the Big Muskegon, so it doesn't get very much fishing pressure, but it does have some nice fish in it. The only thing about the Little Muskegon is that you're going to have to hike over some pretty big hills to get to some good fishing water to make it happen. So, but once you get there, you might catch something.
Nick asks, what impact would the removal of the major hydroelectric dams have on the Coldwater fishery?
Well, when it first happened, depending on how they did it, it would probably have a pretty negative effect. But in the long run, you know, the thing about dams is that they build them on the highest gradient water, because that way the dam, you know, has pretty deep water. So Croton and Hardy were traditionally built on some of the highest gradient water. So basically, you're talking about a really big rapids underneath there. You know, the thing of it is, though, a lot of our fishery is migratory fish. So you're talking about spreading the migratory fish that we have over a lot more surface area. So it would probably make the steelhead fishing harder. You'd probably have more natural reproduction, both of steelhead and of trout. You know, if Croton Dam ever were to go away, then you'd have the Little Muskegon open to migratory fish and trout fishing and spawning fish. So, I mean, that would be there would be some benefits to it, but the initial part of it would be pretty bad. So.
A question from Scott. He asks, any tips for the type of water I ought to be looking for summer bass?
For summer bass, yes. You know, the Muskegon holds smallmouth up its entire length and down its entire length. And it's all good. You know, in the rocky areas, you'll have crayfish, but one thing to really look for as summer comes is that weed beds will typically form on the side of the river that doesn't really look like it should have fish on it. So don't be afraid, if you're not catching fish on the really obvious side of the river, to look to the other side if it's got any depth, because a lot of times the nondescript water will actually have the biggest smallmouth, because what happens is that the bait fish shift to the other side of the river, and so the predator fish do too, even though it might not look like a good fishing spot.
Okay, thanks. Looks like maybe one last question from Lindy. She says, thank you, Kevin, for the presentation tonight. Where can a gal find those awesome streamers you are known for? Do you sell them in any of the local shops? Thanks for the presentation. Yeah, same things. Yep.
You know, I sometimes tie some custom orders, but I haven't much. You know, typically I'm so busy guiding. But, you know, give me a call because a little free time right now. So yeah, but the Muskegon River Fly Shop has some of my patterns. I think Nomad Anglers has some of my patterns. Both those outfits have been really good with the things that have been going on. So just thank you to them and support your fly shops. And there you go.
Okay. Hey, thanks very much. Appreciate it. In case you're curious, we had almost 200 people between the Zoom and the YouTube going on today who watched. And then we're going to send out, we've recorded this. We're going to send out a link to the video so people can watch it again or for the first time.
Sounds great. Kevin. Thank you.
And with that, we'll conclude. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.